The title of this first lecture podcast is Why a History of World Civilization? I'm hoping that by exploring this question, coming up with some answers, looking at some of the key issues behind it, we will be able to understand the purpose of this course and the best ways to approach creating historical knowledge. In order to engage the question, why a history of world civilization, we're going to deal with it in three parts. The first part addresses the name of this course. The second part talks about why we have this course. And the third part addresses why we need this course. The first thing that we'll address is the name of this course. As you know, the name of the course is A History of World Civilization. Now, within this name is one word that creates a lot of problems, and so I want to address it now so that we'll have an understanding of what we will be talking about, what we won't be talking about, and some of the ideas that are associated with key words in the study of the human past. The big word that I'm concerned about in the name of this course is civilization. The use of the word civilization creates problems in a couple of different ways. The first way is that people don't often have a very precise meaning for that term. They have a vague sense of what they're talking about or what they perceive to be civilization. And this sense of what civilization is seems fine until you start to break it down and come up with some very definitive characteristics. Once you start to do that, you begin to find that you pretty much use the word civilization to describe the societies that you like the best or that you want to somehow extol for some reason or another. And oftentimes those societies that don't fit the label of civilization, they may still have those same characteristics, but you just don't want to include it in civilization, so you find a way to exclude them. This is not very good because it's not a very precise use of the term. And that's fine, and I've seen lots of different scholars come up with lists of characteristics or other qualities that they say define a civilization. The problem is, because those lists of characteristics and qualities can vary, and sometimes certain societies are in and out regardless of which characteristics they have, it just doesn't seem to be as useful as far as an analytical term as some people think. Of course, some people who use civilization as part of their work may not be trying to create a very solid intellectual argument. Instead, they may be arguing a political point or trying to characterize the human past in a certain way to support an argument in the present. This is not unusual. We see this over and over again, and that actually can be a legitimate use of history. You use history to talk about what to do in the present or how to interpret the present. The problem is, this is always a problem, the terms you use and how you use them can have an effect beyond just evidence, beyond just the argumentation. And civilization is one of those words. It's a very powerful word. This is something that we'll talk about throughout this entire course, is the power of certain terms, certain words, and how they shape our conceptions of the past and how we create history. In order to avoid some of the problems that come with the use of the word civilization, I prefer to use another term, and that's world history. So instead of talking about a history of world civilization, my preference is to study and talk about world history. Whereas civilization is an exclusive term, world history is an inclusive term. By that, I mean that world history in and of itself doesn't automatically leave out fundamental aspects of the human past. And many of those aspects of the human past that civilization doesn't deal with, I think are some of the most important things that we need to look at and understand and apply to our own understanding of our own times. These can deal with a huge range of topics, and many of them were in their formative stages or had been part of the human experience for many, many generations, tens of thousands of years before civilization ever existed. So rather than stretch the meaning of civilization to the point where it doesn't really have any specificity at all, I'm okay with keeping the word in existence, and I'm okay with some of the ways that people use it. But to describe the human past, I'd much rather go with a broader, more inclusive term such as world history. Okay, having looked a little bit at some of the issues that come up with the name of this course, I'd like to move on to talk about why we have this course. One of the reasons why we have this course actually has to do with the word civilization again. In this case, it's Western civilization. Just as civilization is a very powerful term, so is the term Western civilization. And Western civilization has been this concept that has been applied really from the 19th century, from the 1800s, used to describe a common past for European peoples and societies, as well as European descended peoples and societies over here in North America or in Australia, or all these parts of the world that were colonized by Europeans and have represented historical, cultural ties to Europe in more recent times. And the idea of Western civilization is what we call a historical construct. By that, I mean it's the work of people at a certain time looking back at the past and assembling various pieces and elements of that past, putting them all together, and then calling it one thing, or treating it as one historical process. As with any idea or concept, we can debate whether Western civilization was a historical reality or not. I'm not really interested in that particular debate here. The big point that I want to get across is that this historical construct of Western civilization, for at least 100 years or more within what we call the Western Academy, European and American universities, has been used to interpret the entire world and the past of the world as though somehow it must be framed within the context of Western civilization, its rise, its maturation, and some would argue its fall and going down that path, but we're not going to worry about that at this point. For me, world history is not about Western civilization. World history is not bound by Western civilization. World history is not bound by telling the story of Western civilization. Many people who adopt the Western civilization model tend to interpret the past and look back as though it's all about this long path towards the Western world coming into being and then becoming globally dominant. Well, that is one interpretation, but for me, that really isn't the point of the human experience, and telling that as your key story is not really getting at the fundamental elements of the human past. It's an element of the past, but it's not the story of the human past. And so in that sense, we have this course, this world history course, so that we can explain the human past beyond a model such as Western civilization, such as some of the other limiting, much more narrow models or conceptualizations of what we've been through, what we're going through, and to some extent anticipating what we will experience in the future. Now, while you may not be so familiar with Western civilization as a model for understanding the human past, there is one model that is very prevalent. In fact, you probably have experienced it many times throughout your educational career, and that's national history. National history, not surprisingly, deals with the history of nations. And the national history that you're most familiar with is history of the United States or American history. We often get it in primary school, you get it in middle school, you get it in high school. Sometimes you have to take state history. You get this many times throughout your education. A big part of that is that oftentimes people feel that understanding the history of a particular nation makes people better citizens of that nation. So it is often taught in schools. That's not very surprising. The difficulty for understanding world history is that world history is much older than the history of nation states. While understanding the histories of nation states may be very important for understanding world history over the last couple hundred years or so, it doesn't help us at all in understanding times before, understanding those many generations, many years, many centuries before the emergence of nation states. And for this particular class, History 101B, a great deal of the human experience takes place outside of and before the existence of those nation states. So we can't use that as an effective lens to interpret the past. Certainly not the past much further back beyond the 18th century. And this takes us to one of the key reasons of why we have this course. Just as world history is bigger than Western civilization, and just as world history is bigger than national histories, the reality is that our world is global. It includes peoples and societies and cultures that don't easily fit within either Western civilization or your standard national histories. And because our world today is global, we need to construct histories that are also global. This requires us to come up with some ideas or historical categories that we're not really used to using or that may seem uncomfortable at first, but we have to do it. Otherwise, we will never really understand how our world came to be. I would argue that if we don't understand how this world came to be, then we can never really understand how it is in the present. This argument leads to our third point, and that point is why we need this course. I contend we need this course because historical knowledge is essential to live in and contribute to our world. Now, a big part of that is what we talked about with the previous point, that if you understand the history of how things came to be, then you can understand how they are in the present. That's a big part of it. But another element of it that I think is essential is that you can understand human beings better if you understand human history. You can develop a much deeper understanding of human behavior. There is no greater source of information or pool of knowledge about human behavior than the study of history. A lot of times historians don't even think about that, and certainly people who don't think they're interested in history don't think about that. My experience has been that we study world history so that we can understand ourselves. We can understand ourselves in the present, we understand our ancestors in the past, and from that we have a much deeper understanding of human experience, human behavior, and human potential. And there is another reason why we need this course. I think that it's something that's very basic to our humanity, and that is our desire to connect to our ancestors. And throughout the past, people have expressed this desire to connect to ancestors, often through spiritual ways. And these ways can include ancestor veneration, as well as creating legends or folklore, mythology about figures from the past, oftentimes people who are perceived as being fathers or mothers of the current generations. But there are also non-spiritual ways of connecting with ancestors. One of the most common forms in the world today is the national history. And national histories serve the very same purpose. They're talking about where we come from, whoever we is. They're talking about founding fathers and mothers, and they often do it in very mythological terms. At some point, national histories seem to cross a line from being just recounting the past or something that's much more of a standard history into being myth-making. We have the very same thing that happens in this country, and it happens in many other places. The reason why this process plays out over and over, even in what seems to be very different than the old spiritual ways of connecting to ancestors, is because it's so human. It's very basic to who we are. And so in that sense, studying world history is another way of satisfying that need. There's another reason why I think we need this course, and it's also tied to a fundamental aspect of our humanity. It's the fact that we die. Now, we die, but knowledge can live forever. And so instead of our experience, our knowledge, our understanding of the world fading away with us when we go, it's possible to construct bodies of knowledge that we can then pass on knowledge from one generation to the next, and ideally accumulate and process and develop bodies of knowledge over time. Now, this is exactly what has happened throughout human history. This explains how we've developed new technologies, new cultural institutions, new forms of society, all the things that we see as the basic elements of the human experience over time, and including the creation of the things we call civilizations. All of these elements have come about because of our ability to develop and pass on knowledge across generations. In all honesty, I don't know if our society today values this process of intergenerational knowledge transmission as much as earlier generations did. This is unfortunate because not only does it hurt the transmission and development of collective knowledge, it may also create a sense of distress among people in the present. The detachment from ancestors or knowledge about ancestors, knowledge about the human past, in some ways is a denial of something that's very basic. It is the denial of something that is needed as much as our biological requirements. Now, this may sound a little strange or a bit far-fetched to you, but one of the things that we find when we do study the human past is that the cultural, intellectual, emotional needs of people are just as important as anything else, just as important as their material conditions. In fact, we often see that these intellectual, emotional, psychological, and cultural needs are even more important than the material needs. We will see this again and again when we talk about the major developments in world history. And so it is my hope that our study of world history in this course will give you more than just information to pass the class, to earn credits, and then earn a degree. I would very much like for you to take the historical knowledge that we create in this class so that you can then contribute to the collective knowledge of humanity and to our world.